Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Center for Book Arts and the final session of the Contemporary Artist Book Conference. I'm Karina Reynolds, and I'm also a member of the Contemporary Artist Book Committee. For those of you at home, I am going to be your host for the session. So just to let you know, if there's anyone who is just listening, I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair, dressed in all black, and I'm standing in front of a projection screen in the book bindery of CBA. The CABC, or Contemporary Artist Book Conference, has been held since 2008, and this year it's organized by Center for Book Arts, where we are right now, in conjunction with Print Matter's New York Art Book Fair. We'd like to thank our conference sponsors, the Brooklyn Rail, Sorted Library, the San Francisco Center for the Book, and Stephen Burry. Center for Book Arts is on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people. I ask you all here in person tonight and all of you online to join me in acknowledging and uplifting their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations and the lands in which you are tuning in from. Over yesterday and today, we have hosted a range of sessions exploring questions about artist book visibility, what it is now, and what we can imagine it to be in the future. If you missed any of the earlier sessions, I didn't see you earlier, hi. If we missed some of the earlier sessions, they're going to be up on the website starting on Monday morning, so please tune in. They were really, really good. I watched all of them, and so highly recommend. For those of you in the room with us tonight, these sessions are also being live streamed, which is why we had all the tech going on. So the recording of tonight is also going to be online. So if you do not want to have your voice in the recording, don't talk. And for those of you at home, as I said, I'm going to be your in-person host. So if you have questions for Kameelah or for the audience or for myself, please put them in the YouTube chat. I will be bringing those to Kameelah at the end of her talk. And don't just feel free to use the chat, but really we encourage you to use the chat because the Contemporary Artist Book Conference is all about a critical dialogue. So we're here to have conversations, and we want to see you guys having conversations online and after the talk, having conversations with each other. And before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to thank the staff of Center for Book Arts and our supporters who work all year long in service of the artist book community. Thank you. And if this is your first time at CBA, let me tell you a little bit about what we do here. 365 days a year, we work to support the artist book community. And we are supporting people who are making artist books. We are supporting people who are studying artist books. We are supporting people who are curating and collecting artist books. And we do that through a really wide range of programming, which includes talks like tonight. We also have 8 to 12 exhibitions annually, and I definitely encourage you to take a look at the shows after the talk. There's a really good one up right now, Books Revisited, organized by Taylor Fish. And if you all missed the last show, this one was really great, and the catalog here includes actually a reproduction of a piece by Kameelah. So I definitely recommend that you take a look after the talk. We also do artist residencies. We have opportunities for writers, for artists, for publishers. We have opportunities for curators. So come back, get involved. We're here to help you. And we also have an extensive collection of artist books and books about them. So if you're looking for a technique or you're trying to discover something about artist books, this is the place. Our collection is available and searchable online, and our librarian is here 5 days a week. So come in, you don't have to make an appointment. We really encourage people to touch things. So. And now for the main event. Kameelah Janan Rasheed is a learner, an artist, and a publisher working in Brooklyn, New York. Rasheed is the author of 3 artist books, An Alphabetical Accumulation of Approximate Observations by Endless Additions 2019, No New Theories by Printed Matter in 2019, and the digital publication Scoring the Stacks by the Brooklyn Public Library in 2021. Her writing, including long-form essays and interviews, has appeared in Triple Canopy, The New Inquiry, Shift Space, Active Cultures, and The Believer. Rasheed's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, and she was a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow in Fine Arts and a 2022 Creative Capital Awardee. Please join me in welcoming Kameelah Janan Rasheed.
All righty. Can you hear me? Yes, alrighty. Thanks so much for having me. I was a resident here at Center for Book Arts back in 2013, and it was a really formative time for me. So I'm always excited to return. I also am just excited because in 2020, when the pandemic hit, I was supposed to give the keynote in LA. And so I'm really grateful that I've been invited back 2 years later to give a keynote. So welcome. I'm Kameelah Janan Rasheed, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of things tonight. And one of the things that I sort of want to focus on in this conversation in talking about visibility and talking about artist books, I started talking about what parts of artist books are visible. And I'm particularly focusing on process. Alrighty, so we are here, and I like to always say when I give talks, because I think that we have both the right and responsibility to change and revise. This is where we are now, so it is 7:43. You are listening to this talk. You may hear me do another talk in a week where I say very different things, and so I always sort of like to locate myself as a person who is always thinking about revision, always thinking about how new information sort of overturns how I understand the world. And so our time together, we're going to be doing two things. We're going to have a lecture, that's by me. We're going to be wandering a little bit, and then we're going to have some time left over for discussion. I also have sort of like questions built in. I used to be a high school teacher, so there's no way for me not to do this like a high school teacher where there's like moments of like, pause, let's reflect. So there will be times we will have to talk to other people and turn and say things. So just go with it. It'll be great. I promise it'll be amazing. So a quick note on form, a poet that I really love, they often talk about the way that they sort of set up their sets for poetry. And Sean Henry Smith talks about this in the context of intuitive, never random. And so one thing that I like to say when I give talks is that nothing is planned in the sense that I haven't sat down to write notes about what I'm going to say. I've collected a series of images and excerpts that are really important to me, and I'm just doing live processing. So you're very much witnessing live processing in terms of letting intuition guide what I want to comment on. And you may see moments as they mentioned here, where I may just invite certain elements that are already included. And so this is sort of part of my ethos of thinking about revision, thinking about intuition as a form of responsiveness and self-listening that are important for how we process and make sense of the world. So I'm just gonna ask for you to say hi to your neighbor. Like literally say hi to them, thank you, say hello. I feel like I spelled neighbor incorrectly, but I think I spelled it correctly. Alrighty, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. And whenever I give talks, I always say to myself, I should have just gone ahead and purchased like that headset, that Britney Spears one, because I like to move around a lot because I used to be a high school teacher. So I was like, I have to keep your attention by being a moving target. But I can't necessarily do that because I'm trying to click at the same time, but I will be moving just a little bit. So someone told me, I think it was Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who wrote Undrowned, that she often thinks about dedicating things that she's doing to a particular person. And I've tried to be engaged in that practice of thinking about when I'm giving a lecture, when I'm having a show, who is it dedicated to? And so I'm dedicating it to my lovely parents. This is my dad and my mom. They met when they were in school at UCSD. In the 70s, they met in the science library. So we like to make jokes about them having chemistry. And they later moved up to the Bay Area where they raised me and my four brothers. It wasn't just me, there were four other people. And during that time, one of the things that I want to mention is that the city that my parents chose to move to was a city that literally had not been incorporated for more than like 6 months. We moved to a city called East Palo Alto. It's a city in the Bay Area, in the peninsula specifically. And it's a city that has had a long history of sort of innovations in terms of publishing, innovations in terms of education. And I feel that there was something very opportune about my family moving, choosing to live in a city that was coming into itself. The city was learning itself. They brought kids into this context, and we were all learning these things together. And so I want to sort of start, I always actually start autobiographically because there's no real way for me to sort of think about what I do when it comes to publishing and printed matter without thinking about where my sort of interest or compulsion towards printed matter came from. And so my parents converted to Islam in the early 1980s. And during that time, this is obviously before the presence of lots of computers. Most everything that my parents had around Islam, around just sort of things in our home were paper-based. And so a lot of my growing up was sort of looking at all these paper-based things, prayer schedules, before we had like these watches that tell us what time prayers were, going and looking and seeing the sort of typeface that was used. This is the brother who used to sell the Muslim Journal, which was a major Black Muslim publication. And I remember my dad having stacks and stacks and stacks of these and me going through them and being fascinated by the colors and being fascinated by the typography and being fascinated by the folds of the paper. And so I feel like very lucky being raised in this context because it taught me such a indirect sort of appreciation for printed matter and typeface and how information is organized. And one of the other things that I'll mention, and I brought these books with me, so I'm very proud of them. The other thing that I'll mention is that because my city was a city that was going through lots of changes, was experimenting with lots of different modes of education around learning, around publishing, and it wasn't a rich city, but one thing we did have, there was an older woman in a trailer at school. And during lunchtime, you would go into this trailer and this woman just had binding machines. She had binding machines, paper, and you had a choice. You could be outside playing or you can make books. Obviously, I chose to make books. I spent almost every single lunch period with this lady, and I cannot remember her name. I hope she is doing well, but she sort of set me up on this set in motion a lot of things for me around publishing, right? So as a first and second grader, I was making books. We were having book readings where adults would come and listen to me read a ridiculous book about when I was a baby. So imagine someone being 7 years old writing a book about when they were a baby, which is something clearly no one remembers, but somehow I felt like I should write a book about it. There's also Suna, which is my sci-fi book. It's about warring planets and how these warring planets had to figure out how to cooperate and share resources. There's also a book about the Ankylosaurus, and I'll share these at the end for folks to flip through them. They're kind of ridiculous. I was obsessed with this particular dinosaur, and so I made a pop-up book about the Ankylosaurus, which I'll show because I was very impressed with myself at this time in terms of being able to create a pop-up, which if you are 7 years old and have poor motor skills, is a really exciting thing to be able to do. And so I'm also sort of thinking about the folks in my life who sort of pushed me in this direction and how that sort of formed, again, my interest in printed matter, publishing, making books. And so Octavia Estelle Butler is a person that I always return to because why not? It's Octavia Butler. And in this interview she did in 1991 with Randall Keenan, he's sort of asking her about her interests and what sort of things she's into. And she says, all sorts of things influence me. I let things influence me. If they catch my interest, I let them take hold. And I love this language because there's something around almost a sense of being in a trance or being possessed by a particular interest. And she talks about this more in her essay, Positive Obsession, where she sort of talks about this sort of obsession around a particular thing and how that drives her. And so in my childhood, the thing that sort of drove me, I was fascinated with books, how they open, how they close, how they were categorized in libraries, how the paper that was used. And I would make my mom take me to Kinko's to make copies of random things, or I would make her take me to the craft store to try out and just touch different papers. And so in my adult life now, where that sort of turned up is sort of a deep fascination with not only publishing my own things, but also collecting. And so I have a large collection of Black printed matter, and I'm most interested in sort of thinking about the visibility of Black printed matter in the context of sort of collections at institutions, but also what does it mean to collect these things and to put them in circulation in a more ethical way. A lot of the things that I have in my collection are things that have been sold to me. And so I'm really interested in sort of thinking about commodity in relation to printed matter, what can and should not be sold. And then also what does it mean to sell a piece of printed matter that doesn't necessarily belong to you and should probably be repatriated to the communities and the individuals who created that publication. And here are some, as I said, I'm obsessed with typeface, and some sort of close-up scans of a couple of things in my collection. You'll notice, again, a sort of interest in typography. This is from Jihad Publications with Mary Baraka. I think Black Pride is also with them. And this one had a large grease stain on the front. And I think the seller thought I didn't want it, but I also really like thinking about printed matter and human contact. So I like that my printed matter gets used, and I know that it eventually will be disintegrated, and that's perfectly fine with me. Some more images, Barbara Smith, Homegirls. And then I think before I jump into some stuff, I wanted just to quickly go over like an abbreviated chronology of my relationship with duplicating and imaging technologies. So much of my involvement with printed matter has come out of a deep, deep interest in actually machinery. So for the folks who are old enough to remember mimeograph machines, I remember being sent to the office. I was sent to the office because I was disruptive, because I was bored. So I got sent to the office to make copies. I remember cranking on the mimeograph machine. And I remember the Xerox machine and going to Kinko's with my mom once my mom started homeschooling my younger brother and being obsessed with the heat of the machine. I remember putting my body just up against the machine and being like, why is the machine warm? Or putting my hand to the machine and being completely obsessed with the fact that a machine could take an image of my hand and make something instantly. In 2015, I worked with an etching press. And you'll notice that the Center for Book Arts is not mentioned here because me and letterpress had beef. Me and letterpress fought a lot. I love letterpress now when I can use a polymer sheet, but me and letterpress fought a lot. But I had a residency here where I used a lot of the machines around letterpress, and then an etching press at the Lower East Side print shop. And then eventually started gravitating towards Xerox machines and scanners. And a dear friend, PJ, gifted me a risograph machine, which is in my home now, which is a lot of fun. And so I'm going to say some stuff about myself now. So as was already stated in the introduction, I'm a learner, and this is a title that I take very seriously. Sometimes I fight people a little bit when they write, so you're a visual artist that does installation. I was like, look, I am a learner. I learn stuff, and then I make stuff to share a bit of what I've learned. And that could be a poem, it could be a dance, it could be a lecture, it could be an installation. But I hold clear that I'm a learner. That's my priority. And when I say learning, I'm not sort of thinking about the traditional form of just like sitting in a classroom, but thinking about learning as this very important process of slowing down. There's so much acceleration in terms of accumulating degrees, accumulating knowledge, accumulating all of these things. For me, learning is about slowing down, resisting the capitalist impulse to be efficient and productive, to say, how can I actually pay attention to the things on the margins? What can a tangent do for me that staying on the right path may not do for me? What does serendipity and curiosity get me? What does improvisation get me? And so learning is a reminder. It's a spiritual disposition of thinking about the fact that I know very little. And so I'm not really ever in the position to make a certain statement, and that I'm constantly in this revolving practice of learning, being a learner, being alongside other people who are learning. To the right or to the left, here you'll see a picture of me raising my hand. As I tell this story, it is almost like 99.9% me raising my hand to answer a question that no one asked. Sometimes when I got bored, I would make up the questions and then raise my hand and then answer a question no one asked. So that's me. And clearly I was annoying. That's fine. It worked out. And so there's the about the author page there in these books here. And so one of the things that I loved about the publishing process at my school was that you were told to write about the author. Like they were like, you're 6 or 7, you still have something to say about yourself. So below it says, I'm 6 years old. My mom is a nice lady. I'm nice like my mom. I have 6 people in my house. I have more people. I have 15 people. My grandpa died. My name is Kameelah. There are some clear issues here. Why my name is last, why I'm just dropping this random traumatizing news about my grandfather's death, we don't know. My mother also tells me there were not 15 people in my house. We're still trying to figure out what those other 9 people are, but she's like, there weren't 15 people, and there weren't. Now, as I think, there were not 15 people. As I get a bit older, I'm now 7, I have a last name. My name is Kameelah Rasheed. I'm 7 years old and go to Flood School. 7 years old is very young, but I like to read, write, and do art. I live in East Palo Alto. I'm in the 2nd grade. I'm a good reader. And this is my favorite about the author, because I'm now 37 and I'm looking back at this 30 years later and saying, yeah, I like to read, write, and do art. And that is literally what I'm doing. So it's nice to look back at this, and it's nice to sort of think about myself as a person who had a firm sort of footing in this notion that reading and writing and being a good reader, whatever that meant to me at that time, was important. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this lecture. I've divided into 3 sections. I'm going to start talking about ecology and revision and sort of ground this in Beverly Buchanan's notions of objects and process. And so the one thing that I want to say about this conversation today is that I'm really, really invested in sort of thinking about anti-choreography and anti-dance in terms of what are the other ways that we can engage in publishing practices that are not about finality, that are not organized around the obsession of a final bound, perfectly organized, never to be touched again publication. So I'm just going to ask for you to turn to someone and tell them, what is the last thing you revised and why did you do it? What's the last thing you revised? My mother told me it was an angry work email that she revised. So I asked her all these questions. So just take 1 minute. What's the last thing you revised and why did you do it? Take another 30 seconds. Another 15 seconds. Another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. If I can get everyone's attention up here. Everyone's attention up here. Thank you. For the folks in the back who gave me the hands. All right, thank you. I've lost my high school teacher voice. I used to be able to command a room of 60 kids instantly. I don't have it. Does anyone want to share, just 1 or 2 people, what's the last thing you revised and why did you revise it? Don't be shy. I can see all of you. I will cold call you like a high school teacher. Don't make me do it. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, congratulations. Anyone else?
Okay, I am instead of 28 verse 27, I have 29 verse 27. So I have to revise 29 to 28.
Yes.
Was the last thing, definitely the last thing before the
Thank you. So there's an address change, there's a CV change. And I, again, PJ, yes, I'm going to interrupt the talk to say hi to PJ. Hi, PJ. I lost my train of thought because I saw a lovely human being. The reason why I'm asking this question is because I think oftentimes we're in the practice of just doing things without slowing down to say, oh, why did I revise that? I asked my mom all these questions because I was like, yeah, what's the last thing? And when she said I revised an email to check the tone because I still felt the way that I felt when I first wrote it, but I recognized the audience would not receive it in that tone, it made me think a lot about the ways in which our revision are often designed for an outward audience, right? We're revising something to fulfill an expectation. We're revising something because there is some assumption that someone outside of ourselves needs to know that information. And so one of the things that I want to sort of talk about in terms of revision today is like revision as something that we're doing because we need to share information with a larger audience, but also revision as something that is a process that we do internally and that we do for ourselves as well. Sort of grounding my practice, what I want to say is that most of what I do is sort of couched in the language of ecology. I think about my practice as a series of inquiries that are ecological. And I'm always hesitant about using this language. I did not major in science. I love ecology. I love physics, but I'm always like, Kameelah, can you use the terms that are not things you study? And then I decided, yes, I can, because I know how to read and I've read these things. And so in thinking about my work as being ecological, the most important thing that I like to emphasize is a sort of focus on ecosystem or relationality. I'm making things not as individual projects that sort of live in their own world. I'm making a set of interconnected things that are talking back to one another, that are echoes of one another, that have haunts of one another, because I'm most interested in aliveness. And sort of this interest or fascination or concern around aliveness is because there is so much conversation around Black death, which is a very real thing, that I also want to double down on conversations about Black livingness. And so all of my work is organized around this principle. How do I create ecosystems between my projects? How do I assert an aliveness, a livingness, a sense of relationality? And so I think about Catherine McKittrick often and her notions of Black Atlantic livingness. I think about Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, also Dr. Catherine McKittrick, who talk about let this text be as alive as you are. I think about Fred Moten, who talks about work being open and refusing to coalesce or to be enclosed. And I'm also, of course, thinking about Octavia Stell Butler and how she talks about primitive hypertext, this notion of bringing together elements, disciplines, texts, processes that don't seem like they go together, but they actually marinate and produce something ultimately more beautiful than if we were sort of siloed in one discipline. And finally, thinking about ancestry co-written texts, this notion that nothing that we produce in this world is done alone. There's no such thing as a solo show. There's no such thing as a solo produced book. We're always in collaboration, intentionally or unintentionally. And she talks about this in terms of collaboration with ancestors. I like to think about collaboration with organisms as well, other organisms, processes, people, machinery. And so in talking about Black Atlantic livingness, I just want to keep emphasizing this of like going through my own track notes in Google and sort of replacing the places where I put lived instead of thinking about sort of the gerund of ing of reminding ourselves of livingness. And so that sort of interest in livingness shows up in sort of my fascination with life cycles that show up in ecology, life cycles that show up in other places. And so when I first started approaching this language of life cycles, I got really interested in the ways in which folks were thinking about this particular life cycle model. So this comes from a book called The Life Cycles of African-American Literature and talks about the progression of sort of an archival matter, right? So it's created either because a book was written or for some other reason. It's captured by an institution, right? That thing is created, is brought into an institution. It's stored, maintained, made available to folks, and it's disposed of, meaning that it's maybe deaccessioned or just no longer on public view. One of the questions that I like to think about in my practice, particularly when it comes to publishing, is sort of perpetuity. What might it mean to keep a text in a perpetual state of creation, never letting it be captured in its final form, but constantly editing, constantly returning to it, constantly republishing the same thing over and over. And by the same thing, I don't mean literally the same photocopy of the same book, but recognize that when we come to a product, we come to that product as a new person as we're learning. And so each republishing, each iteration is sort of an accretion of our learning over time. And as I said, I was dedicating and am dedicating this to my parents because implicitly, much of how my parents sort of operate in the world has influenced how I think about revision, how I think about publication, how I think about sort of these processes. And so when my father was converting to Islam in the early 1980s, 1982 to be specific, he was still in pharmacy school at UCSF. And so he would basically flip over his pharmacy school notes and then type out a bunch of notes. And then he would photocopy parts of the Quran and other Islamic texts and sort of cut them up and create this sort of study guide, sort of live processing for himself. And the thing that I find fascinating about this sort of set of notes here is the way in which you have these different typefaces, these different sort of modes of sort of wayfinding. There's Arabic script that's sometimes written in a different color. Then there's this block writing that he has. And as you look through his sort of archive, you see that his handwriting gets a bit more wispy. And so I very much enjoy looking at these and did not realize that his work inspired my work until I was giving a lecture at Brown and someone said, "Hey, does your dad influence your work?" And I was like, "What? I didn't say anything about my dad. What does this have to do?" And they're like, "Go back to your slides." And I was like, "Oh, actually, yes." Very much the way that my dad has organized information and text in his own learning process is how I organize, pulling different pieces, annotating, thinking about how to compress many temporalities into a singular sheet of paper. So this sheet of paper holds many time periods, many thought processes, many versions of himself. And so I'm just gonna ask for you to take a moment to turn to someone again. I want you to talk to them about what is a book? What is a book? Literally turn to someone. This is a serious question. What is a book? I'm so excited for the answers. I'm like, I don't know. Take another 30. Take another 15. Take another 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. No one can see me. Thank you. I appreciate the folks in the back who always start the wave for me. Anyone want to volunteer? What did you say a book is? What is a book? There can literally be no wrong answer. I know we are in the Center for Book Arts, so it may be intimidating to define a book, but it's okay. What is a book? A process. A process. A book is a process. What else could a book be? Ice cream. We're going to talk about your ice cream, yes. A book could be ice cream. A book could be a process. Anyone else? A conversation. I like all of these because they're all relational, right? I think sometimes when you think about a book, we think about it as just like a binding of pages that just goes out into the world. And so most of the way that I think about what a book is in relational terms. It is something that I can engage with many times over multiple occasions, and there's some type of process that's unfolding. My mom, when I asked her, said it's a portal, which I also really liked. Yeah, right. I'll let her know that you gave the for her. She'll appreciate it because she was like, oh, I don't know if I want to say anything. Maybe I'll get the wrong answer. I was like, Mom, just what do you think? And she's like, it's a portal into other worlds. And I was like, okay, Mom. Next time we're going to be co-facilitating this. So I'm going to go into story time now because I think one of the things in terms of visibility when it comes to artist books is that the artist book shows up in the world as this magical thing, and we don't have any idea how it got here. It just shows up in the world, and it's beautiful and it's bound, and we buy it and we hold it. And we don't know how it got here. And so I want to tell you a story about this book called No New Theories. When I moved to New York in 2010, when I was like a wee baby, I was like, it would be amazing if Printed Matter just lets me volunteer for free at their book fair. That was my only hope and wish in life. So I was like, I love Printed Matter. I've seen the book fair from afar. That's all I want. In 2017, I was invited to do a show at Printed Matter, which obviously blew my mind because my only hopes were to be a free labor. And then in 2018, or in the end of that show, they said, hey, do you want to make a book? Who says no to Printed Matter for making a book? I said, absolutely yes. And so we went through this entire process. We made the book. I was super hyped about it. Here's a copy of well, you're going to understand why it's one of them. Here's a copy of the first book. And the reason why there's a first book is because the first edition had some errors in it. And when I say errors, there were some things that were misprinted. There was like text that wasn't supposed to be there. And I didn't notice it because I got the books from Printed Matter. I came home, put them on the bookshelf. And I was like, oh, I'll look at them in a few days. So I was like, I made the book. Like, I'll look at them later. I opened up the book. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. That's not supposed to be there. I keep flipping. And I was like, interesting. Okay, interesting. And then I flipped out because I was like, oh, my goodness, the book is ruined. And this language of ruin is very important at this point in 2018 because I had been giving these talks and sort of writing this language around like uncertainty and provisionality and being okay with mistakes. But when the mistake happened to me, I was not interested, right? It's a sexy concept when you're trying to curate a show. It's a sexy concept when you're writing up an essay, an artist statement. It is not that sexy when it happens to you. It is horrifying. And I remember 2018 being like the most depressing summer because I could not get myself around this notion that something existed in the world that wasn't in a perfect final form that I had imagined. And I remember that 17 copies had been sold. And I remember texting Keith, who I work with on the book, who's a dear, dear member of the Printed Matter family. I was like, Keith, we got to burn the books, take the books down, burn the books. And he was like, we don't burn books. And I was like, sure, we got to burn. He was like, we can take them off the shelf, Kameelah, and then we're going to find a solution. And so part of that solution is that we started being like, well, maybe we can cut some pages out. I was like, bro, there are 1,000 books. We're not cutting 1,000 books. So we went through this whole process and we sort of took a break until the top of 2019. At the top of 2019, I got an email, and that email was like, you know what, the public, someone said, yep, we made a mistake somewhere. Wasn't Printed Matter. I think the printers were like, yeah, we messed it up. And they're like, we have money, we're gonna reprint your book. And I was like, great. Here are all the things that need to be fixed. Let's go. And there was like a very, very distinct moment where I realized that I had an option. I could just republish the book and pretend those other 17 copies floating out in the world with someone did not exist. And if anyone ever called me out on it, I'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Or I could lean into it entirely and just say like, yeah, actually another book preceded this. And so what I did is I actually just leaned into it. As a person who doesn't like leaning into uncertainty, this was very difficult because I had to contend with a version a prior version of myself existing in the world in a way that I could not control. And anyone who reads my newsletter knows that I like control. I like certainty. So in that process, what ended up happening is that the book actually went from 176 pages, which was this original one, and it swelled to 256 pages. Because not only did I say, hey, you know what, we should just like do some stuff. I was like, and also let's just add a couple more spreads to this. And so it was a very exciting process for me because it felt like a process, right? I feel like the first time that I approached that book project, I was kind of like, get the book out, get the pages in, let's go. And I wasn't really slowing down to sort of think about this as you said, a process. And so in this process, a couple of things happened. We processed, we went back and like looked at things we wanted to keep, things we didn't want to keep, and just really jumped into it. And so in this first sort of note around revision, I want to sort of think about revision as a form of call and response. And so the reason why I'm sort of thinking about it as call and response, as a Black person, as a Muslim person, thinking about call and response is an integral part of like how I was raised and how I operate in the world. Thinking about call and response, and that's just a footnote from an interview I did. Call and response usually is sort of thinking about someone else is calling, you might respond. You're calling, someone else might respond. But it can also happen within a multicellular organism, right? So what does it mean for us to call and response within ourselves? And so think about call and response as a revision, right? Calling a former self and responding with the newer self. Calling on your present self to respond to my former self. Calling on my former self to respond to my present self. And so sort of how I approached this project was, if this is sort of almost like track changes, right? In a Word doc or a Google Doc, what do I want my track changes to look like for this publication? And so in thinking about this, and this is not like where I was in 2018, 2019, this is like now as I'm processing it, I keep returning to the work of Pope L, who talks about in this one particular catalog about his work in this particular project being notational. And he says, by notational, I mean that each work was a notation towards some larger sketch, perhaps leading to some even larger mock-up. And this is a really liberating way to sort of think about an art practice, a publishing practice, that nothing is actually final, that all we are doing are making drafts towards other things, towards other things, towards other things. And so this frees up a lot of space in my mind where I'm kind of like, ooh, that sentence has to be perfect. Ooh, that design has to be perfect. Now I can say, actually, I'll make this book. I'll make another book. I'll make a zine that goes inside the book. I'll post something online that's a comment to the book. I'll publish a series of footnotes about the book, but this is not the final thing. The other thing that I want to sort of mention in thinking about revision is the work of poet Banu Kapel. I had a studio visit with Alexis Wilkinson, who I've worked with before, and I was telling her, like, I am so bored. Like, I'm so bored with my own practice. And she was like, have you read this book of poetry called Schizophrenic? And I was like, no. I will read it. And I remember opening it up and being sort of skeptical, like someone told me to read poetry to free myself from my practice. And I was like, stop being curmudgeon, read it. And so I remember opening it and I felt like she had already told me sort of the premise of the book, but I remember reading it and being like, oh. So she, in writing about how she wrote the book, she writes, towards the end of this project, I felt the great strength of the page, its ability as a fibrous surface to deflect the point of my pen, the paper, and then the screen as weirdly reflective, repelling the ink or the touch. That beautiful language of trying to make something permanent and final, and the page being like, nah, we're not doing that. Don't even try it. It's not going to be permanent. And she writes, on the night I knew my book had failed, I threw it in the form of a notebook, a handwritten final draft, into the garden of my house in Colorado. It snowed that winter into the spring before the weather turned truly warm. I retrieved my notes and began to write again from the fragments, the phrases, the lines still legible on the warped, decayed, but curiously rigid pages. I love this so much because she is literally collaborating with climate, right? She threw this thing into the yard, be like, I can't even deal with this. Like, imagine being so pissed off about what you've written, you just throw it into the yard and you're like, oh, maybe I should come back and see what it is. She comes back and sees it and she notices that the pages have been eaten away by climate, by dirt, by insects, and writes from there. There's something so deeply beautiful about, again, this reminder of life cycles. This notion that the text doesn't die. Our relationship to the text might die, but that text keeps being revived over and over. And there's something very literal in this sense, and that is set in dirt for a year, and she retrieved it, and it literally grew new forms. And so in this process of making the book, we did the traditional thing, right? I didn't throw it out into the dirt. I wish that I had known about this book. Maybe I would have tried it. But we went through this traditional process of like getting the spreads, checking everything, making sure that everything was where it needed to be. And I will say that the current book still has errors in it, y'all. After all the work I did to republish it, it still had errors. And I think the only difference this time is my response to that. And so this is the book, our 2019 publication, right? And so there's the front, the back, some of the insides. I'm going to show you the part that I'm most proud of in a moment. I'm proud of the whole book, actually, but there's a part that I'm most proud of. So there was a conversation that my friend Jessica Lind and I had. And one of the things that occurs when you're publishing things, if you're doing this over a long period of time, is that you may have an interview or a text written like in 2016, 2017, and the book doesn't come out until 3 years later. And we were like, cool, that's fine. Like, if I need to update anything, then I'll just tell people verbally. But Jessica and I were kind of like, yo, in 2017, when we did this interview, we were different people. And so we were like, do we want this going out again? We were like, it's fine. We didn't say anything embarrassing, but we were like, this is an opportunity to actually think about live processing, live revision, live track changes. And so what happened is that we took the original text, which is in this book. We went through and did our edits in terms of just like clarity again. And then I printed it out, gave it to Jessica. She took it on a road trip and wrote a bunch of notes. Then she gave it back to me, and this is where we ended up. We ended up with a spread of an interview that is most akin to what I think learning looks like. And this is what I mean by this. There's an associative network of references, citations, annotations, processing that's happening on a single sheet of paper. And as I mentioned it before, when people are like, how does your dad influence you? And I was like, I don't get it, dude. What are you talking about? This is why. Because literally the layout of this page looks almost exactly like his notes. He probably is owed some royalties at some point, but it looks exactly like his notes. And the thing that's most important for me in this process of designing this in this particular way is that I got tired of trying to hide the artist book process and trying to make it feel clean and easy and fun. And some parts are just absolutely terrible. Like you're trying to birth something into the world and you don't know how it's going to be received. You don't know. There are parts that just don't feel good. But I actually wanted the book to actually be a live, secretive process where we can actually talk through this, right? And so those 17 people, maybe one of those people's in the room now who have this book, I encourage you to look at this one in comparison to this one, because there are some beautiful things that happen in terms of being able to see the growth in terms of connections that are being built, to see sort of the overturning of ideas that you're kind of like, yes, absolutely, that makes sense. So then turn back on yourself and say, actually, it makes no sense. And so I'm thinking about artist books and visibility in this way. I'm most interested in how do we actually have relationships with artist books that are not around holding people to the fire, like this is what you wrote in 2019, but to say it's what you wrote in 2019, I can make like a little timeline or ecosystemic map of how your thoughts and your processes have grown. And so some of the annotations in this text include everything from like a Tupperware ad to like excerpts of Samuel Delaney's work to Emily Dickinson. It's a pretty multidisciplinary sort of spread of associations. And in the spirit of Octavia Butler, sort of thinking about this primitive hypertext that can happen on a single sheet of paper. And so towards the end of the book, there's this spread, and it just reads, I can't be a comprehensive sentence. And I really appreciate this, and it feels weird to say you appreciate something that you created, but I can say that. I appreciate this because I think that a sentence is imagined as this unit of grammar that is supposed to be comprehensive. When you finish a sentence, the thought is done. And so what does it mean to actually say, I can't be a comprehensive sentence? I actually can't offer or give you something that's not available. I can't be comprehensive. What you get today at 7:43 is all I can offer to you. And I'm going to move quicker because I recognize time is going. I want to give sort of this notation from Gertrude Stein and Tinder Buttons. This is the 2017 edition of it, which includes a bunch of interviews about Tinder Buttons. And she writes, she says in this interview, this book is interesting as there is as much failure as success in it. When this was printed, I did not understand this creation. I can see now, but one cannot understand a thing until it's done. When a thing is in the process of doing, you do not know what you are doing until it is done, finished, and thus you cannot explain it. Until then, you are struggling. And I kind of like this notion because she talks about being done. And I'm like, I wonder what she thinks done is, because people are still engaging with her text in a very specific way, but sort of thinking about this being on the other side. When do you get to the other side of a process? When do you get to the other side where you actually understand what you have created? And I also just want to point back to Beverly Buchanan, who is an amazing artist who's unfortunately passed, had a great show in 2016 at the Brooklyn Museum. This book by Amelia Groom talks about her work. And one of the things that she talks about in relation to Beverly Buchanan's work is this notion of objects and process. And so in thinking about a publication, again, not as this final object that lives in the world, but as an object that's in process. It may be slow process. It may be so slow that's not perceivable by you, but it is a process. It is a mode of continuation. There's also Stanley Eveling, who works in a lot of theater work, who talks about an object as a slow event, which I really love as sort of a reference to hold on to. A single object is not sort of fixed in time. An object still vibrates, has frequencies. What does it mean that it is a slow event? And you can't like have a talk about publishing and ongoingness without mentioning Lucille Clifton. I remember doom scrolling at the beginning of the pandemic and coming across this poem, which I'm going to read because I really like reading this aloud. I'm not done yet, as possible as yeast, as imminent as bread, a collection of safe habits, a collection of cares, less certain than I seem, more certain than I was, a changed changer. I continue to continue. Where I've been most of my lives is where I'm going. And this is such a beautiful poem for sort of reminding ourselves of ongoingness, right? This notion I'm a change changer, as possible as yeast, to always be on the cusp, but never really getting to the point, but always trying to work towards a point. And that point probably moves all the time. And of course, Octavia Butler, who reminds us that all that you touch, you change, all that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. I'm going to skip this. This is part of what I said before. Sometimes I'm feeling it, sometimes I'm not. I have no beef with Anais. So I want to talk about it right now. I want to just get into gathering and dispersal because I want to sort of move us towards discussion. Sort of in this portion, I want to sort of think about the notion of a book as this bound object that's finished, right? And I want to sort of think about what does it mean that this book is just a form of gathering, like this is a moment of gathering. And what does it mean to then disperse a book? And so there's a quote here actually from Chang Yu Chen, was actually speaking about her earlier, literally one of my favorite human beings and favorite publishers. And she on her website and thinking about publishing says, publishing as a dandelion spreading its seeds, which I think is just absolutely beautiful. And so I'm going to be speaking for a little bit just about this process of sort of gathering pages together and then what it looks like when those pages are dispersed as part of the process. And again, these visibility politics around what part of the publishing process is visible. I'm going to skip this question, not because I don't care about what you have to say, just because of time, and I want us to get into some discussion. Whenever I sort of think about gathering, and whenever I'm thinking about anything related to comprehensiveness, I always come back to this ayat. And the ayat is just a verse in the Quran. And so on Fridays, Muslims are encouraged to read Surah Al-Kahf, which is the 18th chapter. And I love reading it because each time I read it, I'm like, oh, okay, Kameelah, calm down. You're not going to figure this out today. Go chill. But there's a particular ayat at the very end, 109, which says, if the sea were ink for writing the words of my Lord, the sea would be exhausted before the words of my Lord were exhausted, even if we brought the like of it as a supplement. And I like to think about this as sort of a statement about the observable universe. Each time that we think that we've captured some part of the observable universe, we've comprehended something, we've captured all the knowledge for it, as soon as we think we've done it all, something else is presented to us as a mystery. And so I like to sort of take this with me and thinking about publishing and finality, which is there's no part of the publishing process that will ever be finished or complete. There will always be more to say. There will always be more to do. And Wikipedia reminds us of this often. They have something called this little note among above dynamic lists, which just says this is a dynamic list and may never be able to satisfy particular standards for completeness. And this is pretty much my artist statement. I will never be able to satisfy anyone's standards for completeness. And so in thinking about this process of trying to gather things, Emily Dickinson, who is one of my favorite poets, not just because I like her poetry, but because I like her sort of epistolary involvement. She was writing to the editor of The Atlantic, Thomas Higginson, and they went back and forth because he was trying to edit her work. She didn't want her work to be edited, but this is one of the letters she sends him. She says, "Dear friend, are these more orderly? I thank you for the truth. I had no monarch in my life and cannot rule myself. And when I try to organize, my little force explodes and leaves me bare and charred. I think you call me wayward. Will you help me improve?" Now, Emily does not want to improve. Emily is fine. She is I'm convinced that she is just trolling this man, and I love every part of it. because she's like, oh my God, I wrote these poems. Are they better now that you've edited them? Please help me. And she doesn't want help, right? Because we've seen her work be republished in the form that she wrote it. But what I like about this is the language she used. When I try to organize, right? When I try to get everything into one nice container that makes sense, my little force explodes. The language of trying to contain a force, and then it just explodes. And so that's sort of the premise of like, what does it mean to gather pages in this form? What does it mean to think about a book as having its own force? And what does it mean to not force it to always be organized, but to allow the little force to have a bit of sprawl and freedom? And in thinking about Lynn Janan always talks about this in The Rejection of Closure, writing forms as not just shapes, but forces. And Laura Mimosa Montez's Threshold, she also talks about this quote from Cecilia Vicuna: a poem only becomes poetry when its structure is made not of words, but forces. And so sort of holding on to this notion of like a text, a publication, and I'm obviously taking some liberties here, thinking about a publication, not just as a collection of words or pages or images, but literally as a thing that has its own force. It has its own dynamics. And in terms of physics, if something has the ability to create force, to allow force, then it is something that is living, it is moving, it is engaged. And so I always think about this image that I made several years ago of this sort of like misshapen shape, where I'm trying to sort of think about perimeters and supple perimeters. And I'm thinking about this notion of wholeness, right? And so whenever I'm trying to sort of think about what a book is, I always like to go to Wikipedia, because I feel like Wikipedia does something where it gives you something very simple that then you can pick apart for 5 hours. And so in Wikipedia, they said, in an unrestricted sense, a book is a compositional whole. And I said, who is defining a composition? Like, where does this definition come from, right? And so this sort of spun me into a bunch of questions. What is wholeness? How do we consider something to be whole? And what is this notion of completeness? And so I settled on this sort of conversation around binding, right? Chang Yu-Chen and I taught a class in the south of France this summer to dance students. It was a language class. It was absolutely amazing. I can't dance, but we taught a class to dance students. It was amazing. And so one of the things that came up in that was this conversation around binding as a form of gathering. And I always like to look at trilateral roots. My dad is definitely upset that I have not stuck with my Arabic studies, but what I have stuck with is like obsessing over trilateral roots. Arabic, like Hebrew, has trilateral roots, which mean 3 letters have like meanings that are in a circumference of many things, right? So Jim, Meme, Ayin is a trilateral root that gives us some language around gathering, right? If someone goes to Jummah prayer on a Friday, there's a momentary gathering. And so I wanted to sort of keep going with this language of like, what does it mean to think about a book as a form of Jummah, a gathering, a moment of gathering? And so I also started doing more research on binding. So I was like, what is this thing with binding, right? And I'm looking at this book now on modes of assembling and thinking about this too, right? Binding is creating community among a set of materials, a process of creating a container or context for something to happen, a lasting attraction between atoms, ions, molecules that enable a formation of chemical compounds, tying or restraining people as a form of erotic pleasure. Binding is about this process of bringing things together. And I want to pull that apart just a little bit. Thinking about a book as a temporary gathering or bond gives us the option of thinking about what happens when these pages that are gathered as friends and homies for a short period of time then sort of disperse and take on their own lives. I want to mention that a book is not quantum entanglement. This seems like a silly statement, but hear me out. When people think about quantum entanglement, they're thinking about the reality that these particles that were linked at one point will always be linked forever. They're always in relation to one another. And I want to think about the book as a temporary gathering, not a quantum entanglement, which means that the pages, the things in the book can carry on to have lives of their own outside of that one moment, right? This is a temporary moment. Many of the things in this book have had other lives. They've been in installations, they've been on projections, they've been on walls. And so in thinking about the book dispersed, thinking about the physical architecture when that becomes the binding system. So I want to show a couple of images. This is from a show in 2017 at ICA Philadelphia that was curated by Meg Only for a show called Speech Acts. And this was the first time that I was in a space to make a space. And so when I did the show at Printed Matter, Max, who runs Printed Matter, said it looks like a book exploded onto the wall. And I became really obsessed with that like language of like a book exploded onto the wall. How would you take a book and literally translate it into an architectural site? And so I started to think about all the folds in the wall, all the corners in the wall as sort of these gutters of a book page, right? Of a book. thinking about the ways that I could work with the architecture, thinking about a sentence that sort of starts in one area and then gets finished on another wall. Thinking about the footnote, thinking about what goes above headers, and thinking about all the elements of a book, but in a spatial context. In this process, what ended up being a lot of fun was sort of thinking about how text can be rearranged in the spatial context. We know the affordances of a book. There are only certain directions based upon paper that things can happen, right? And thinking about the gallery space as a compositional field where there's a different type of play, there are a different set of affordances. This is another example of work that sort of did not live in a book first, but will eventually live in a book and is being put into a book now. This is at Prospect 5 in New Orleans last year. And I mentioned this because in a lot of ways, the images that were produced for this show, I was thinking a lot about literally how these might be combined into a book, but also, again, thinking about the architecture as sort of a guide, a way to think about wayfinding and organizing a book in this context. And so there's this question, as I'll talk about reading later, of what it means to read with your body and not just with your eyes. And so I want to end here before I do the final part. Sorry, I know I gave you like, oh, she's done talking. Thank goodness. There's like one last part. I promise I'm done. To sort of think about this language of anti-dance, right? So this is the print that I made in 2018, and it just reads an exhausting dance, 10 dances. She's an anti-dance we need in the future. And I'll tell you this, when I make things, I'm not gonna lie, sometimes I have no idea what I'm talking about at that moment. And there's just something that says I'm compelled to make the thing. And so I like revisiting this text because each time I come back to it, I was like, oh, maybe that's what I was thinking about. Maybe that's what I'm thinking about. And now 4 years later, I'm like, oh, that's what I was thinking about. Sort of thinking about sort of the expectations, the protocols, the choreography around certain processes, and the anti-dance being sort of moving against, moving otherwise, a refusal of that sort of dynamic, right? That says that a book is only a book and you can't just take pages and put them up on a wall. The notion that you can't publicly revise a book and put it out in the world with the same exact title and just go about it. So thinking about what is the anti-dance that I want to engage in terms of working otherwise within publishing cultures. And so to wrap up, I just want to talk about reading because you can't talk about artist books and visibility without actually talking about how these books are actually engaged with. And so in thinking about this, I want to bring in Audre Lorde and how she talks about the erotic as a measure between the beginning of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. When I gave a talk mentioning Audre Lorde at the Poetry Project in early September, I had to give this whole preamble. I was like, you guys are not going to hear about my sex life. I'm just talking about Audre Lorde and the erotic. So I feel like people were about to get nervous. And I was like, chill out. It's not what I'm talking about. And this is part of what Audre Lorde is talking about, is that people can't talk and think about the erotic outside of sex, right? The notion that what we're talking about is what brings you pleasure. And so one of the things that I do want us to think about is that in the reading process, what brings you pleasure? As you read something, what brings you pleasure? Not for compliance because it was assigned to me, but as I'm reading a sentence, what about that sentence brings you pleasure? And so I had a question about what is reading. We'll get to it, I promise. I want to just lay some groundwork for the current condition of reading, right? And this is the image from the book, which says, fix the same perimeter containing everything, all things are organized as uncertainty, right? This notion of our proof is now complete. We understand everything's been collected. And so I want to take us to Maria Inago-Clavo, who wrote this beautiful essay that was published in eFlux in April 2020, where she is talking about Indigenous art and sort of thinking also about this notion of decoding and knowledge production. And she writes, in his writing, Glissant analyzed the link between knowledge, possession, and control, observing that the etymology of the word comprende, to understand, derives from prende, meaning to grab hold of or to grasp something. The ongoing Western colonial desire for transparency, despite the impossibilities of clarification, is what I term a confessional ontology, where to know also involves a certain ownership of things, nature, and other humans, the Western fantasy for control. However, to decode spirituality is to undermine its potential, and worse still, to risk destroying the potential once and for all. I love this excerpt because I think it's a reminder that sometimes we approach information, text, books, we approach it with a desire to take ownership over the ideas, right? We want to conquer the information. We want to comprehend, right? The notion of comprehension being the sole impulse for reading. As a high school teacher, we're not saying read a book so that you can explore your worlds and think about things. We're saying read the book so you can comprehend it, so you can give me an answer, right? And so what does it mean to break yourself up from the impulse of engaging with a book as only something from which you extract information, and thinking about it as a pleasurable experience where I don't need to walk away with information. I could walk away with just a good feeling on the inside or the outside, wherever you need feeling to be. Right? There's also Clarice Lispector who in this text talks about this effort. She says, I'm trying to seize the fourth dimension of this instant now, so fleeting that it's already gone because it's already become a new instant now that it's already gone, right? This text is her trying to think through her need to like hold a moment, to like capture it, right? And this is most of how we've been trained and conditioned to think about reading and engaging with text, is this motion of capturing, right? I need to underline the right things so that I can then repeat those right things to someone else. Also thinking about this essay from Elvia Wilk, also in eFlux. I don't work for eFlux, but I mention eFlux a lot, where she's thinking about the language of mutual love. And this like hit me hard when I read this. She writes, mutual love is often thought of as mutual recognition. I see you for who you are and you see me back. But recognition is inevitably also a naming, a fixing, a pinning down. In order to recognize, you have to categorize, and categories are notoriously inflexible. Recognition, if understood as a projection that disallows the evolution of self and identity, becomes restrictive rather than liberating. However, inadvertently, the recognition required for mutual love can easily slip into a form of control. Now, what does mutual love have to do with books? I promise this makes sense. What I'm talking about here is that when we're reading a text, oftentimes we're looking for some moment of mirroring, right? We're reading a text to see like what resonates, what reminds me of something else. What does it mean when we were doing that process? Is that sometimes that means that we overlook other things in the text because we are looking for a mirror of ourselves, that moment of recognition, that moment of nuance where there is a sense of mutual love. And so one of the things that I want to think about in terms of the current conditions of reading is how do we actually read a text without seeking ourselves, but being open to finding other worlds. As my mother says, going into a portal. She said, I read books because I want to see into other things. And what does it mean to go into a text, seeing other things versus looking for a reflection only of self? I don't want to talk about her right now. We'll talk about it later. I want to sort of end on the notion of reading otherwise. And this is sort of something that I think is difficult because we've all been conditioned within certain education systems to engage with text, engage with books in a particular way. And so in thinking about reading otherwise, I just want to mention some ways of reading otherwise. The first one here is from Umberto Eco. I talk about him a lot. And some of his more famous sort of quotes and quotables are, of course, a text as a lazy machine that appeals to the reader to do some of his work, which I remember telling my students when I was teaching California, like, guys, when you get the book, the text is just lazy. It's just waiting for you to like get in there. They're like, what, lady? I was like, yeah, the text is like waiting for you. And they didn't get it because obviously I did not set it up in a way because the assignment was still for them to do comprehension work. So I set it up as like Umberto Eco, whole lecture about Umberto Eco. And they're like, but you still want us to write an essay proving our comprehension, right? He goes on later to sort of talk about this notion of inferential walks. Inferential walks are basically, as I'm reading a text, I'm noticing holes. A character whose storyline is not fulfilled, a page in the book where a sentence is not complete. And as a reader, I'm trying to process and make sense. I'm trying to fill in the blanks, right? On those inferential walks, I'm annotating, I'm making an associative network of all these new ideas. And Umberto Eco goes on to say that through that process, a ghost chapter is written. This language of ghost chapters, I keep saying this is the most beautiful thing I've heard. I think I'm just like, everything is beautiful and I'm just in a really great place and mood. But this is like literally one of the more beautiful things because the notion of each time, and I'm gonna make this about myself, each time someone reads this book, there's like another ghost chapter or a ghost book that exists based upon the associations that someone else is making that like haunts this text, right? The notion that each time someone reads a sentence, they're thinking about something else and that sentence sort of exists in the ether as something that haunts the original. And so I really think a way of reading is to sort of think about a collaboration between yourself and the author, right? So this is not a separate passive moment where you're just going in to extract meaning to figure out the answers, but what does it actually look like to collaborate, to create a ghost chapter? The other thing that I'll mention is Derek Walcott's poem, Six Fictions, where he writes, pray for a life without plot, a day without narrative. And so thinking about one approach to reading, particularly artist books, is not looking for a plot. What does it mean to not engage with the desire for a plot or narrative, but to engage in a more embodied way where you're just sort of moving through the text with an interest in not so much understanding, but experiencing, feeling, touching the page, looking at how text lays on the page, but not with the desire to come out with a full narrative that you can then explain to someone else. And I think about this in terms of what it might mean to read with your entire body, to go through a space, to engage with all the text, but not to feel that you need to consume, make sense of everything in that moment. As we sort of wrap up, I'll mention Ashon Crawley in this essay that there might be Black thought, nothing music in the Hammond B3. And then this essay, he's talking about the Balawi Diary, which is a diary written by an enslaved man. It's been translated, parts have been translated, the beginning and the end, but the middle is impenetrable. And people have been trying to penetrate and trying to get into that text for a long time. And so he sort of offers this question of to write which emerges as incomprehensible is to write non-readability into the text, to write the necessity to think of a different relation to objects that are supposed to be easily captured. So Ashon Crawley is offering us an opportunity to think about a different relationship to the text that's not about solely comprehension. We're gonna move on. We're gonna move on. We're gonna move on. We'll get to it. Everyone knows Roland Barthes. Like, I could talk about it, but I feel like I'd be redundant. We're gonna move on. And I'm gonna move on because I selfishly want to get to a part about licking words. Yeah, I'm just gonna move on. I don't need to explain why. I'm just moving on. So I took a class at the height of the pandemic. I was like, let me just take classes. So I was like, I'm not doing anything. Let me just take classes. And I took this class with Rudolph Ware, who is a scholar of African Islam and Sufism and a range of things. And in this class, he was talking about this notion of drinking the Quran. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, it's paper. What are you talking about? So I remember going through his book and I was like, oh. And the reason why I'm saying because this is literally the most fascinating thing I've read. I said that before. I use a lot of superlatives and I have to stop because then you don't really know where I stand. And so it says in the Kitab Adab, Muhammad cites hadith on the merits of erasing Quran tablets with the tongue, thereby incorporating the word of God physically. There is an argument in favor of the opinion that there is no trouble in licking the revelation. The notion that you are literally reading as a form of consumption, reading as an embodied process. And so I went on this sort of journey to figure out, like, who else is talking about this? I went to Catholic school as a Muslim student. I chose to go to this school, very excited about going to Catholic school. And I became obsessed with the process of communion because I was like, so y'all telling me that you just ate Jesus. And I was fascinated, not like judgmental, but I was fascinated by sort of religious practices that are around consumption. So I started finding these other things, particularly about a Peruvian community, where you would whisper words into a small bowl and then of mother's milk, and then it would be consumed as a way of healing, but also having those words put into the body. So sort of this notion of embodied reading became really interesting to me. I don't have any conclusions about this, but I include it as a way of thinking about reading otherwise, which are deeply more embodied, not just reading with your eyes, but reading with all parts of your body, tasting as a form of reading, consumption as a form of reading, ingestion as a form of reading. And so again, I keep ending on these sort of notes around anti-dance. I won't be redundant. I'm actually going to stop talking because I should stop talking. And I think that we should talk to each other. Is this a good time to talk to each other? Yeah. Let's do some discussion. Yeah. So you have to talk. Don't leave me hanging. I know that you're going to facilitate questions.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be facilitating questions from both the live audience and the virtual audience. So if you're online, please type your questions in the chat. And if you're in real life, let it rip. Does anybody have a question, thought, comment, something to share?
Well, earlier on in the presentation, thank you, Kameelah.
Thank you.
Spoke about putting matter that should never be solved. I was wondering, off the top of your head, speaking the criteria that an object would be.
Yeah, so I have a collection of two things. I have a collection of Black printed matter and I have a collection of Black vernacular photographs, right? These found photographs. And so in the process of collecting these, what would often happen is we would go on eBay and these other places and people would be selling them. Of course, I went to eBay. My concern was often around, I'll be honest, white people selling Black printed matter and Black vernacular photographs. Like, why do you have them? And why are you circulating them as commodity and not repatriating them? And so my real concern around this is the ways in which Black material culture has become a commodity. The way around Black material culture is never repatriated. And while we're in these battles, particularly with African countries, we're like, I need my shit back, like give me my stuff back. And then having to argue about getting their stuff back, I have a very, very strong opposition to people owning things for the sake of owning things, right? If they are Black vernacular photographs and you are not a Black person, then I say you should not be selling them. You can give them to an institution that specializes in Black material culture instead of selling them. And so I have a large issue with people profiting from the conditions that led to those photos being lost to begin with, right? So a lot of times is that someone lost their home. Like my family, we lost their homes, we lost a lot of stuff. I don't know where those photographs are, but I'll be damned if I go on eBay and see that you're selling them, right? And so this happens a lot. When it comes to Black printed matter, this also happens a lot. We'll go online and look for a piece of Black printed matter from like, I was collecting a range of things like Muhammad Speaks and Bilalian News and Muslim journals, all these things from a very particular moment in Black Muslim culture, and having to pay. I paid so much money to people to get stuff back that is not there, that actually belongs to me, right? And not belongs to me in the sense that like I have previously owned it, belongs to me and people of my community. And so there's not so much a criteria as much as there is a desire for me to ask people who are not Black to be conscious of what they're doing when they're selling things. And if you do have the opportunity to give them to an institution, then you should give them to them. If you have the opportunity to repatriate, you should repatriate them. But actually making money off of the conditions, which are slavery and extreme loss, I don't like, no, you just, it feels like a very, very crappy situation. And when there's that whole issue at Harvard where those photographs of enslaved folks, people are actually arguing and saying that you don't get your family's photographs back because we own them. Like, how do you own someone's family's pictures? You already own their family. You don't get to own the pictures of the family too. That doesn't make sense to me.
That would probably be hard day. Welcome to Brooklyn. I'm a visitor from there, so I didn't know where I was going, but I walked past this call to the parents archive, and I was like, wow.
Yeah.
And organization is doing this.
Yes.
And archive of
Yep.
Back. A lot of archives and
Yeah.
So archiving kind of like big.
Yep.
They're doing what you said.
Yeah. I love Interference Archive for all the reasons you just said, because it is, you can literally walk off the street and just walk in and take a box out. There's no one standing over your shoulder being like, do you have the qualifications to access it? It's like, are you a person who can pick up a box? And if you can't pick up the box, we'll pick up the box for you. And they've been around for a long time. Everyone should support them. Their collection is accessible to anyone. I know they're digitizing things now, and there's something so deeply beautiful about not treating archives as commodities that you have to fight for access to, but as something that is completely accessible. And I'll also shout out CBA because you guys said, just stop on in, just come in. You don't need to fill out 15 pages of paperwork to access it. If you can get here, and I'm sure you guys would help people find a way to get here. I don't want to volunteer you, but I'm sure you can do something nice. But I think this question around access and availability, and I come up against this a lot when I'm trying to do research and be like, why can't there's tons of stuff about my city of East Palo Alto that I cannot access. I can't access because they're locked up in an institutional archive and I have to prove that I have the right to access it. I'm gonna say something happy soon, I promise. Yeah.
Access is a complicated thing. You know, I work with documents like the New York Times.
Of course.
When it needs the stuff falls apart,
Absolutely.
you wait, but you know, you get them. But looking at them means see them literally fall apart and they are gone. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, go ahead, sorry. Like your rape.
Like, or you know, the books literally fall apart and you put
Yeah, I mean, I don't like analogies to rape unless we're talking about, yeah, ripping, I'm sorry. I'm glad you clarified. I was like, no, it's not rape, sir. Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of like the integrity of the document is important. But I often feel like that conversation or argument around the integrity of the document ends up being an excuse for gatekeeping. So like there are multiple opportunities to digitize things. Even if things are falling apart, like I've worked with enough archives where you can put them in protective sleeves, have viewing opportunities for, like there are ways to do the thing because we've been doing them for centuries. I think, again, the question is, what lengths are people willing to go to make them accessible? And if your only excuse is they might fall apart, well, everything will fall apart. Everything is subject to fall apart. And it's sort of like thinking about what's at stake by saying we're going to keep this thing locked up forever, or we're going to let people access it and learn from it and make change from it. But I think particularly when it comes to movement, print and matter, having that stuff locked up seems counterintuitive at this very particular moment that I would have to go through 14 loops to get information about a social movement that did something amazing to solve a problem. It should just be available, like digitize it, just digitize it. Like we can all digitize, we all have a scanner. You can literally just scan it.
I have a question online.
Yes.
So New Lights Press asks you, can you describe the process for making those installations? Are they improvised, pre-planned, or somewhere in between? How is it similar or different to making a book?
Nothing is planned. So my studio is my home, which means that I have limitations in terms of what I can do in terms of size. So what ends up happening is that I will make a bunch of work. So I'll make like 50 pieces, tiny things, big things, small things. And then what I'll do is I'll have them printed and shipped to a particular location. And when I show up, those things are there. So this is a show in Hanover, Germany, where I had 6 rooms, there are like 120, 30 pieces. Nothing was pre-planned. Only thing I told them, which I'm sure they were annoyed by, is that these works might go in this room. And then I changed everything when I got there, because I think that installation practice, at least for me, is site specific. So I need to go into the space and I need to fill the space. And it always sounds woo-woo, like I'm like, I need to feel the energy, but like I literally need to feel it. And so those decisions are made on the spot, which is why I think it's really good to think about collaboration, being able to collaborate with the art handlers who are willing to like hold up something for a minute, be like here, like no here, no here, and go through that process is super important. So nothing is planned other than the work exists, and then I show up and sort of respond to the space itself. And I think it's different than working on a book because, again, the compositional field is just different, right? You're working on single sheets, there might be some foldouts, and there are limitations to the spatial arrangements. But when you're doing installation, you have 3D space. There's a lot more that you can do. There's more that you can do with sound. There's more that you can do with sort of even light and its interaction with the work. I find both processes fulfilling, but I really enjoy installations because it feels like dancing with work, and it feels like movement exercise in ways that a book in this sort of way is not.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Yeah.
My question's on, time.
Yeah.
We started the Black African archive, and so I'm curious about photography.
Yeah.
In making a book, and you know, is there such a thing as a Black theme in terms of graphic design, where you're making a book and you're making it for African Americans?
Mhm.
When you this kind of typography, but you're making it for men, that's marketing. No, so you see typography that kind of way.
So for me, and I'm going to actually screen back to, sorry, the very beginning, where I had some images. So I think when I think about typography and Black design is that I don't think that there are specific typefaces that I would only present work in if I were talking or making work for Black people. But I do think there's a lineage of typography within Black culture that I like to draw from. So one of the things I saw growing up a lot was instead of using standardized text, right, of like typing something out or letterpress or something of that sort, where all the letters are standard, I grew up seeing a lot of cutout letters that have their own shapes and their own sort of non-standardization. And so when I got into type, I like had almost like a visceral reaction to things that were too standardized. So whenever I make installations, I usually will like photocopy a piece of text and work on the sort of with the noise and the degradation where the A no longer looks like a fully formed A and there's like a bit of it that's no longer thick. or I'll like make an entire typeface by cutting out the letters in construction paper, photocopying those, and then individually making things. So I like things to feel like a human touched them. And I think that with typefaces now, the thing that everything feels very slick and smooth. And I kind of I want some noise, a little like funk with it, like a little bit of like extra, as a reminder that there is a relationship between the machine and the person, and it's not just the machine doing something. So I like to think about practices of typography that introduce noise and disruption and sort of non-standardization. And I'll show, like, even one thing I'll note is that because clearly I don't love myself, I handwrite my slides. So like you'll see like words like life cycles and these things, I handwrite all of them. Then I scan them in, and then it's ridiculous actually. But what I will say is that I was using a Google font, and I was like, all the slides look the same. What if I just made my own? And I was like, it wouldn't be the same if I just made my own font, because that's not the same, because it's still going to be standardized. I need to write everything out. So this is a very long process, but I like the labor involved of writing each letter and having like an intimate relationship with the letter. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I'm happy that Cooper's doing that. I work at Cooper. I didn't know that. So, okay, well, I will harass